The morning on which Flaxwell's peace was mildly disturbed began with the sort of snow that looked determined, even by village standards, to be admired rather than trodden. The chapel's front steps, usually a place where nothing more than hymn books were dropped, presented instead a tableau that parishioners would later describe as most unfortunate, though seldom with identical emphasis. Mr. Hollingby, treasurer of the Chapel Guild and unofficial counter of all things countable, lay in a carefully arranged stillness that suggested either resignation or a final attempt at orderliness. His spectacles rested at an angle conveying mild reproach at the world, which had evidently failed to meet his preferred accounting standards. Inspector Purbright, arriving with his customary air of gentle perplexity, surveyed the scene with no more alarm than he might grant an unexpected parcel. Constable Love hovered nearby in the manner of a man trying not to interrupt snowflakes. Purbright bent toward the body, though not so closely as to imply enthusiasm, and noted that Hollingby's gloves clutched a cluster of envelopes, some plain, others bearing a decorative flourish that suggested the handiwork of committee ladies with spare afternoon hours. "Looks peaceful enough, sir," Love offered, as though peace was something one might misplace. "Quite," Purbright replied. "Peace, however, often prefers to conceal its conditions." He straightened, brushing a faint trace of frost from his coat sleeve. A small congregation had already gathered at a respectful but observant distance. Village protocol required expressions of concern, but not so much as to disrupt speculation. Among them stood Mrs. Blythe, secretary of the Chapel Guild, and defender of propriety in all its documented forms. Her expression was an arranged mixture of dismay and convenience, for she had never been known to miss an opportunity to demonstrate her familiarity with procedure. "It is such a dreadful thing, Inspector," she declared, "though of course one must be grateful the Lord has spared us from anything more untidy." Purbright, who had long suspected that Mrs. Blythe ranked tidiness only slightly below salvation, inclined his head. "Entirely so. And yet we are presented with a matter that requires some understanding." The Reverend Tolliver stepped forward, wearing an expression of clerical concern, moderated by habitual caution. "I cannot think why poor Hollingby would be here so early," he murmured. The chapel was not due to be opened until 9. "Yes," Purbright said, an element of the situation that appears inconsistent with his fondness for punctuality. He preferred to arrive neither early nor uncertain. Mrs. Blythe gave a delicate shiver. Perhaps he came to attend to guild business. He was always taking matters upon himself. Purbright examined the envelopes again. He seems to have been distributing something. Constable Love cleared his throat in the manner of someone preparing to share an unripe observation. "The snow's been disturbed a bit round the steps, sir. Could be villagers having a look before we arrived." "Flaxwell is well known," Purbright said, "for its enthusiasm for preliminary investigation." Several committee members adopted offended expressions, as though the inspector had accused them of burglary rather than curiosity. Purbright made a small note in his pocketbook, more for their comfort than his own necessity. The verger, Mr. Pennitis, approached with the solemnity of a man accustomed to sombre occasions, though they usually involved misplaced hymnals. His moustache quivered with earnestness. "The steps were swept yesterday, sir. Completely clear. I used the sturdy broom." Purbright nodded. "Yet footprints are presently abundant." "Ah, yes." Pennitis glanced at the villagers, who shifted their feet in mild synchrony. "People do get excited, I suppose." The Reverend Tolliver looked desperately for a pastoral angle. "Let us remember that the chapel is a place of fellowship. In troubling times, our instinct is to gather." Purbright allowed the sentiment to pass without comment, though he suspected fellowship had played a distant second to curiosity. He stepped aside, considering the body from another angle. Something about Hollingby's posture suggested interruption, an intention deferred rather than fulfilled. "Mrs. Blythe," he said gently, "did Mr. Hollingby express any concerns at recent committee meetings?" She stiffened. "Concerns, Inspector? We are a well-regulated body." "A remarkable accomplishment." She appeared momentarily unsure whether she had been complimented. "There was the matter of the fate accounts," she admitted, "but that was nothing more than a discrepancy in terminology." Purbright waited. "Well," she said, "a difference between what was considered petty and what was not. Mr. Hollingby's definitions were precise." Constable Love regarded the sky. "Snow might start again, sir," he offered, perhaps wishing to remind the group that weather was often simpler than people. Purbright returned his attention to the envelopes. One bore a faint smear of red wax, though its seal appeared broken. Was Mr. Hollingby in the habit of sealing correspondence? "Only when he wanted to appear ceremonial," Mrs. Blythe replied. "Usually for guild votes." Purbright nodded. A sealed vote taken outdoors on a snowy morning before the chapel opened seemed an occasion demanding further explanation. The inspector observed the steps once more. At their edge, half obscured beneath drifting snow, lay a small indentation, neither footprint nor natural depression. He crouched with polite reluctance. It resembled the mark of a walking stick, though none of the committee presently relied on one. He covered the indentation lightly with his shoe, disguising it from the watchful villagers. "Well," Purbright said, rising, "Mr. Hollingby has left us with several questions and comparatively few answers. It is often the way with diligent men." Mrs. Blythe drew herself upright. "You will keep us informed, Inspector? The Guild must know how best to proceed." "Of course. Progress, however gentle, will be relayed." As the villagers drifted away, some with expressions of concern, many with expressions of interest, Purbright looked once more at the chapel door. Snow had gathered neatly along its lower edge, untouched except for a single, narrow scrape that ran up its right side. An unusual mark, and not, he thought, one made by the wind. Inspector Purbright arrived at the Guild's vestry shortly after midday, when the sun had reluctantly decided to pierce the low-hanging clouds, and a brittle light fell across the polished wooden floorboards. The room carried the faint aroma of wax polish recently applied, and evidently intended to reassure any visitor that order prevailed. The Chapel Guild, in full assembly, had convened with an eagerness one might expect from individuals whose devotion to procedure surpassed their enthusiasm for ceremony. Every chair bore the subtle impression of its habitual occupant, a testament to long-standing habits of deference and silent assertion. Mrs. Blythe, seated at the head of the table, presided with the rigid grace of a woman determined to maintain appearances. Her hands were folded, each finger aligned, as if counting invisible scores. "Inspector," she began, her voice calm but pointed, "we are of course concerned by Mr. Hollingby's unfortunate demise, though I must stress none of us arrived early this morning, and all Guild members were, I believe, engaged elsewhere at the hour in question." Purbright inclined his head, acknowledging the assurance while storing the qualification. "Certainly, Mrs. Blythe, yet one finds, in such situations, that presence may be less a matter of intent than circumstance." His words, precise and unobtrusive, invited reflection without accusation. A small cough interrupted him. Miss Grantham, responsible for the Guild's ledger, and occasionally its more experimental flower arrangements, added with a careful delicacy, "I believe I saw Mr. Hollingby at the vestry door when I delivered the hymn sheets. He appeared preoccupied, though I could not speak with him." "And did he speak to you?" Purbright asked, his tone unhurried. "No, sir," she replied. "He seemed otherwise occupied." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Mrs. Blythe, as if seeking permission to add, yet restraining herself. In Flaxwell, such restraint was valued above candour. Purbright's eyes rested on the ledger Miss Grantham had placed upon the table. Its edges were immaculate, the pages precisely aligned. He noted the absence of any recent annotations beyond routine income and expenditure, though he suspected that appearance had been carefully cultivated. "It would seem, then," he said, "that Mr. Hollingby was engaged in matters not formally recorded, perhaps correspondence or notes intended for a particularly attentive reader." Mrs. Blythe's lips pressed together. "Correspondence, yes. He occasionally, how shall I phrase it, reminded members of certain obligations, always tactfully. He was precise in his manner." "Ah, tact," Purbright murmured, as if tasting the word. "A virtue, certainly, when deployed judiciously. Yet I imagine that even tact may irritate those not fully attuned to its subtleties." His glance swept the room without emphasis, noting shifting postures and the gentle avoidance of eye contact. Mr. Pennitis, the verger, ventured a mild observation. "He was particular, sir, about the way envelopes were addressed. I confess I did not see him this morning, but one might assume he would attend to them early, for reasons of efficiency." "Efficiency," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "A reliable companion when one is inclined to enforce order. And yet sometimes the companion becomes the cause of disruption, particularly if expectations are not universally shared." A soft rustle of paper accompanied Miss Grantham's note-taking. Purbright observed the minutiae with deliberate care. The curl of a lip, a slightly too quick adjustment of a scarf, the glance toward a neighbour that sought reassurance. Each minor gesture contributed to an underlying tableau of polite anxiety. Mrs. Blythe cleared her throat, adjusting her spectacles. "The Guild is, naturally, eager to assist in any inquiries. We maintain complete transparency, though I would remind the Inspector that some of our records pertain to personal contributions, and discretion is desirable." She chose the word as one might a delicate flower, careful not to bruise it with over-familiarity. "Certainly," Purbright said, seated himself with deliberate care, and made a note in his small pocketbook. "Discretion often tempers clarity, particularly in communal affairs, yet where clarity is required, one must occasionally pierce the veil of courtesy." His eyes lingered momentarily on the ledger, on Mrs. Blythe's poised fingers, and on the subtle tension in Miss Grantham's shoulders. A faint noise at the vestry window caused all eyes to turn. Snow clung to the sill in delicate, improbable filigree. No footsteps marked the pane, yet the morning's light revealed a narrow smear, almost imperceptible, that had not been present during the initial sweep. Purbright's gaze narrowed subtly, his mind noting the evidence without dramatization. Mrs. Blythe coughed delicately, directing attention elsewhere. "Perhaps we might discuss upcoming charitable arrangements?" "Of course," Purbright replied, yet he lingered on the silent anomaly by the window. Charitable arrangements are the measure of character, yet also of concealment. One never knows which minor irregularity might reflect deeper intentions. The committee exchanged glances, some reassuring, some vaguely anxious. Even in a room defined by rules, the unspoken knowledge of hidden peccadilloes hung in the air with the weight of a winter's frost. Purbright, observing quietly, detected the subtle recalibration of postures, the faint brushing aside of concern, the polite masking of unease. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Blythe rose with impeccable timing, signalling the discussion had ended. Purbright lingered for a final inspection of the ledger, noting a small indentation on the cover's corner, evidence perhaps of a page removed hastily, or of a hand pressed in thought. He allowed the committee to depart with measured encouragement, each member preserving their dignity, if not their composure. Stepping back into the crisp air, Purbright considered the minor smear by the window and the imperceptible pressure upon the ledger. Both suggested presence and intention beyond mere accident. Quietly, he wondered whether the chapel guild's polished exterior masked a more active pursuit of correction or of concealment. The snow fell gently, and he made note, even in a community defined by courtesy, small disturbances may hint at the motives that will, in time, reveal themselves. The morning following the chapel guild's vestry assembly revealed a village slightly discomfited by its own curiosity. Snow lay in unbroken stretches along the footpaths, except where human or animal passage had intervened. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 8, accompanied by Constable Love, to inspect the grounds with the deliberate attention of men accustomed to minor irregularities, signalling larger truths. The chapel steps remained conspicuously undisturbed since the previous day's congregation, save for one narrow smear across the lower stone, previously noted by Purbright. It suggested contact, perhaps a hand or walking stick, applied without care for appearances. Villagers had begun their own investigation, as if eager to compensate for the inactivity of official channels. Small clusters stood at respectful distances, murmuring observations, their polite concern a mask for curiosity. Mrs. Blythe, the guild secretary, was present, framed by the chapel doorway, with a slight tremor to her hands that betrayed a faint anxiety. She maintained her habitual expression of solemn propriety, yet her eyes darted occasionally to the steps, then to the inspector, as though attempting to calibrate his perception of her involvement. Purbright bent slightly to examine the snow, tracing the sequence of impressions that suggested multiple individuals had walked the area before he arrived. The tracks overlapped, diverged, and sometimes ended abruptly. He made no comment, merely storing the patterns in memory. He knew that to point them out immediately would encourage defensive posturing rather than revelation. A complex arrangement, he murmured, more to himself than to Constable Love, whose brow furrowed in mild perplexity. Several independent visitors, yet one primary movement distinct from the rest. "Could be the verger, sir," Love ventured. "He has a habit of making early rounds." "True," Purbright said, "but the primary impression appears deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the individual intended not merely to traverse, but to leave a particular mark." His voice suggested interest without accusation. The verger, Mr. Pennitis, appeared unexpectedly at the side of the chapel, his thick woolen scarf tight against the chill. "Good morning, Inspector," he said, with solemnity. "I swept the steps yesterday evening. Nothing to report save routine frost. I assure you any disturbances are of subsequent origin." Purbright inclined his head. "I am aware, Mr. Pennitis, your diligence is noted, yet we encounter evidence of minor deviations which may have occurred prior to or subsequent to your routine." Pennitis's moustache twitched with the polite anxiety of a man accustomed to scrutiny. He gave no further explanation, retreating to the warm interior with the air of one slightly reprimanded by circumstance. Miss Grantham arrived shortly thereafter, gloved hands clutching the chapel ledger. Her cheeks were flushed from brisk walking, and she offered a series of carefully modulated apologies for her intrusion. "I thought it prudent to ensure the ledger was safe," she explained. "I believe some members may have inadvertently disturbed it yesterday." Purbright's gaze rested on the ledger, noting the edges and slight imprints, suggesting recent handling. Indeed, one notices that even routine attention leaves traces. Slight indentations, impressions of fingers, small signatures of intention. She looked momentarily puzzled, then nodded with measured comprehension. "Yes, sir, I suppose even a careful hand cannot entirely avoid leaving evidence." The inspector observed the snow again. One set of tracks led toward the manse, veering subtly to avoid a clump of holly. Reverend Tolliver appeared at the path's terminus, hat angled against the sun's glint, offering a brief nod. His expression was composed, though Purbright detected a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth. The Reverend, who prided himself on punctuality, rarely varied his morning routine. Yet these tracks suggested deviation, however slight, and for a purpose not immediately declared. "Morning, Inspector," Tolliver said, voice moderate, controlled. "I trust you are attending to observations of, communal concern." "Merely noting patterns," Purbright replied evenly. "Patterns sometimes speak more clearly than words, Reverend. I trust the morning was otherwise unremarkable?" "Entirely," Tolliver said. Yet his gaze flickered toward the snow near the chapel door, and he shifted his weight slightly as if unconsciously attempting to alter his own impression. Purbright made no comment, but noted the hesitation. The constable pointed to a faint smear across one of the upper steps. "Could be snow melting off someone's coat, sir," he offered. "Or," Purbright said softly, "evidence of a hand deliberately placed." He knelt to examine it. The substance, compact, slightly granular, appeared inconsistent with ordinary melting. One might infer contact, yet contact intended to appear incidental. Mrs. Blythe, standing discreetly behind the inspector, cleared her throat. "Perhaps Mr. Hollingby intended to mark the envelopes," she suggested. "He had precise habits, you know, sometimes an exactness bordering on obsession." "Precisely," Purbright said, rising. "Exactness, when exercised in public spaces, often leaves more than impression. One finds that intent may be traced by subtle irregularities, even where caution is employed." A silence followed, filled only by the faint crunch of residual snow beneath village boots. Each observer seemed to measure the gap between propriety and explanation, some with slight discomfort, others with overt curiosity. As Purbright straightened, he noticed a tiny, barely perceptible indentation at the snow's edge, distinct from the earlier smear. He crouched briefly, observing the mark without comment, recognizing it as a clue more than a spectacle. It suggested movement, but movement deliberately modulated, a careful balance between exposure and concealment. Constable Love followed his gaze. "What do you make of that, sir?" Purbright allowed a faint smile, polite but unreadable. "Merely that someone engaged with the space differently than is customary. Nothing overt, yet enough to provoke consideration." He rose slowly. "We must remain attentive. In Flaxwell, even minor deviations may carry weightier significance than a casual observer suspects." The villagers departed in orderly fashion, each bearing their unspoken questions. Purbright lingered, tracing the snow with his eye, aware that beneath the frozen calm lay intention, timing, and perhaps an unseen observer whose subtle actions might illuminate the broader picture. A single footprint, shallow and precise, led back toward the chapel doorway. The inspector's gaze lingered on it longer than necessary, noting its orientation and the slight smudge of snow near its edge. Someone had been there. Someone with purpose. And for the first time, he entertained the possibility that the morning's disturbances were not accidental, but quietly deliberate. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station shortly before noon, the vestry ledger secured under his arm, and found the quiet hum of the filing room both reassuring and mildly tedious. Constable Love, dusting his uniform as though preparation might summon clarity, greeted him with a nod that carried restrained excitement. Letters lay neatly in a small tray, each one identical in typeface and size, yet distinguished by The faintest variations in alignment and pressure, a subtle choreography of intention. The correspondence recently delivered to various guild members was composed in a tone that balanced courtesy with insinuation, implying improprieties without explicit accusation. Purbright, unfolding the first envelope, noted the careful choice of words. The letters suggested that Mr. Hollingby had planned to expose minor financial irregularities during the upcoming winter fete. Each phrase was couched in oblique civility. It might be prudent to reconsider certain allocations, and a careful eye would doubtless notice the small divergence from expected order. Even the most attentive reader might have missed the undercurrent of admonition. Yet Purbright, attuned to human subtlety, sensed a deliberate orchestration of discomfort. The writer sought to provoke reflection, perhaps repentance, without overt confrontation. Love peered over his shoulder. "They look polite, sir," almost like notes from the vicar. "Polite, yes, and insidious," Purbright replied. "Observe the precision of phrasing. Every suggestion of error is couched in the language of civility. One does not merely criticize, one imposes conscience." He traced a fingertip along the printed line, noting the uniformity. And yet, the typeface betrays the mechanical hand of someone accustomed to administration, not emotion. Love nodded slowly, uncertain whether to be impressed or mildly frightened. "Do you think Hollingby wrote these before?" "You know, sir?" Purbright's lips twitched almost imperceptibly at the question. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone is imitating him. One finds that the absence of the author permits remarkable liberty for those who remain." He placed the first letter aside and unfolded another. It bore a wax seal, broken neatly, which suggested intention rather than carelessness. The envelope smelled faintly of candle smoke, a domestic signature, subtle but identifiable. Purbright made a mental note. The wax and scent could link the correspondence to a particular hand. Miss Grantham arrived at the station, eyes bright beneath modest spectacles, and carried a small parcel. "Inspector," she said, with the cautious formality she used for all minor interventions, "I thought it prudent to provide the Guild's incoming correspondence. Some letters arrived anonymously and others with a degree of insistence that seemed unusual." Purbright gestured toward the tray. "Yes, these. You handled the delivery yourself?" "Partially," she replied. "I merely ensured they reached the intended recipients. I cannot account for their authorship." She hesitated, then added, "The tone seemed unlike anything normally produced by Guild hands, though it bore familiar phrasing." "Familiar phrasing can be a trap," Purbright observed, selecting one envelope. He noted the peculiar combination of archaic civility and pointed suggestion. The writer employs communal vocabulary while introducing subtleties designed to unsettle. It is, I suspect, a deliberate cultivation of unease. Love, scratching at his chin, said, "So it's someone trying to scare them, in a nice way?" "Precisely," Purbright said without sarcasm. "Nice, precise, controlled. The aim is moral correction or exposure, or perhaps both. And in Flaxwell the distinction is often immaterial." They examined the remaining letters, noting recurring motifs, references to careful oversight, to unintended deviations, and to those whose attention may lag. Each letter, though outwardly courteous, seemed intended to provoke self-consciousness, a quiet anxiety carefully calibrated. Purbright leaned back, folding his hands. "It seems clear, Constable, that someone is managing perception rather than events. The Guild members' reputations are being pressured, not by fact alone, but by suggestion. And suggestion, in Flaxwell, is a remarkably effective tool." Miss Grantham added, Some letters were delivered with small, faint marks, perhaps wax or ink. I cannot say for certain, but there is still a subtle distinction among them. Purbright nodded. Indeed, one could pursue that detail. In letters such as these, minor differences often reveal more than the text itself. A fingerprint of habit, a hint of hand, even a trace of personality may emerge. He paused, gazing at the neat tray of envelopes. And, of course, he added in a quiet undertone, we cannot discount the possibility that Mr. Hollingby intended for the letters to circulate after his absence. The deliberate ambiguity of timing is a hallmark of his methods. Love made a low whistle. So he was setting things up, even from beyond, sir? Purbright allowed the faintest smile. Or someone wishes us to believe it. In such matters, Constable, one rarely knows which conscience is being exercised, and which reputation is being guided or manipulated. As the inspector carefully replaced the letters, a faint crease at the corner of one envelope drew his attention. It suggested handling beyond ordinary use, a subtle signal that might, if traced, illuminate motive or opportunity. The crease alone did not reveal the writer, but it hinted that the correspondence had passed through an intermediary hand, someone cautious, deliberate, and invested in propriety. Purbright's gaze lingered on it longer than necessary. Even in a community devoted to ceremony and order, small signs of deliberate attention might prove telling, and in Flaxwell a carefully pressed corner could speak more loudly than raised voices ever could. Inspector Purbright spent the afternoon visiting the prominent households of Flaxwell, each chosen for its connection to the Chapel Guild and its attendant reputational stakes. The streets, crisp with residual snow, carried the faint aroma of burning coal, which blended oddly with the delicate scent of holly wreaths adorning front doors. Purbright, accompanied by Constable Love at a prudent distance, noted the subtle choreography of arrival, gloves adjusted, coats brushed, voices measured. Even in minor gestures, the village revealed a remarkable preoccupation with propriety. His first call was upon Mrs. Blythe, whose household reflected a devotion to symmetry rivaling that of the guild itself. The drawing-room was arranged to accommodate inspection and conversation in equal measure. Chairs aligned, doilies precisely centred, silver glinting without excess. Mrs. Blythe greeted Purbright with a nod that conveyed relief, apprehension, and mild reproach simultaneously. "Inspector," she said, "you honour us with your attention, though I assure you there is little to report beyond what the guild has already conveyed." "Indeed," Purbright replied, removing his gloves with deliberation. "Yet one finds that domestic spaces often conceal subtleties that committee minutes cannot capture. Minor discomforts, slight irregularities, these may hint at matters beyond formal record." Mrs. Blythe allowed a brief pause, then inclined her head. "I am aware, sir. We maintain order in our homes as diligently as in our guild." She led him toward a small table where a tray of biscuits rested, each aligned with geometrical precision. Purbright declined refreshment politely, noting the faint tension in her shoulders as she straightened the linen. "It concerns the morning of Mr. Hollingby's unfortunate incident," he said mildly, "and the habits or intentions of those present in its periphery. For example, did anyone arrive unusually early or later than expected?" "Not that I observed," she replied. "I was occupied in correspondence and arranging the morning's mail." She hesitated, adding with careful diplomacy, "Though Mr. Hollingby had particular habits of his own, sometimes he appeared in places unannounced. One merely accommodated him." Purbright inclined his head, noting her careful selection of verbs. "Accommodated him," he repeated quietly, "a practice often requiring patience and subtle negotiation." His eyes lingered momentarily on a small stack of letters bearing the chapel's seal, then on Mrs. Blythe's expression, which betrayed the faintest contraction of lips. From there he called on the Reverend Tolliver, whose home exuded the mild authority of clerical occupation, polished pew-like benches, books neatly stacked by category, and a faint lingering scent of pipe tobacco, though no smoke currently occupied the hearth. Tolliver offered cordial greetings and led Purbright to a small study, where the vicarage ledger lay open, revealing carefully maintained parish accounts. "Inspector," Tolliver said, settling into a high-backed chair, "I can assure you there is nothing untoward here. All contributions are recorded, all expenditures authorized. Any minor discrepancy is— clerical, rather? Than moral." "Indeed," Purbright said softly, "though minor discrepancies may invite reflection, particularly when combined with unanticipated events." He observed Tolliver's hands, folded with habitual neatness, the left thumb brushing a pencil mark as though unconsciously verifying a figure. "It is rarely malice, Reverend, that introduces error. Yet perception, in a village such as Flaxwell, often regards small deviations as significant." Tolliver inclined his head, lips pressed, acknowledging the subtle caution in Purbright's phrasing. "We endeavour to maintain transparency," he said, "and yet human habits may obscure intention even in the most disciplined households." As Purbright left the vicarage, he noted the faint smudge of coal upon the Reverend's cuffs, a minor imperfection, perhaps accidental, perhaps indicative of handling. Nothing overt suggested wrongdoing, yet he filed the observation as part of the network of subtleties that defined social behaviour in Flaxwell. His final visit took him to Miss Grantham's home, modest and tidy, with the faint aroma of tea leaves steeping in preparation for an afternoon of clerical work. She greeted him with polite, controlled warmth. "Inspector," she said, "I thought it useful to provide the ledger for your inspection. I can attest that handling has been careful, though naturally there is always room for inadvertent touch." Purbright observed the ledger, noting the slight indentation of a page corner, perhaps a finger pressed hastily, perhaps an unconscious mark of anxiety. "Indeed," he said, "one finds that even conscientious hands leave subtle signatures." His gaze travelled to her hands, neatly clasped, and to the small crease at the corner of a letter resting nearby. As they conversed, a gentle but deliberate nervousness emerged, a faint cough, a slight shift in seating, a brief glance toward the ledger, all gestures meant to conceal and reassure simultaneously. Purbright observed without comment, allowing each act of understated self-consciousness to speak. As he departed, the inspector paused briefly on the threshold, noting the faint imprint of a boot upon the doorstep, partially obscured by snow. The mark did not match any ordinary passage, suggesting movement intended to be unnoticed, deliberate, yet cautious. A small, almost imperceptible question lingered in his mind. Who had traversed this threshold before he arrived, and with what intention? In Flaxwell, even a trace in the snow could be more revealing than any confession, and in the households of the guild, the careful cultivation of appearances often obscured, rather than revealed, the subtleties of human behaviour. Purbright made a mental note to revisit each home, not for evidence of malice, but for the minor traces left by intention, hesitation, and self-consciousness. Inspector Purbright returned to the chapel vestry in the late morning, the air crisp with the lingering bite of winter, and found the room prepared for observation rather than assembly. The vestry was conspicuously orderly, hymnals aligned, chairs in exact formation, and the ledger, now the focal point of inquiry, placed neatly upon the table. Constable Love lingered near the door, glancing occasionally at the scattered footprints outside, as though the snow itself had divulged secrets. Purbright regarded the ledger with deliberate scrutiny, noting the crisp edges and the faint depressions along its pages, a subtle record of hands that had handled it with care, caution, or a touch of anxiety. Miss Grantham arrived shortly thereafter, bearing a tray of writing implements, each chosen and arranged with careful deliberation. "Inspector," she said with a measured calm, "I thought it prudent to ensure you had every facility for your inspection. I can assure you that the ledger's handling has been meticulous, though naturally there is always the potential for human interference." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the door, as though conscious of unseen observers or imagined missteps. "Indeed," Purbright said, lifting the ledger, with a gentleness befitting its custodial history. "One finds that even meticulous attention leaves subtle traces. Indentations, variations in pressure, the faintest deviation in line, all may indicate intent, hesitation, or inadvertent communication." His tone was calm, almost conversational, yet each word suggested observation rather than conjecture. Miss Grantham adjusted her gloves, the movement precise yet revealing a trace of nervousness. "Some members," she said carefully, "have been unusually attentive since the incident on the chapel steps. I cannot comment on motive, only that their interest in the ledger appears heightened." Purbright inclined his head. "Heightened attention may suggest curiosity, concern, or a desire for reassurance. In Flaxwell these are often intertwined. One seldom encounters one without the others." He turned a page of the ledger with measured care. Each entry, though routine in appearance, bore minor inconsistencies, small variations in handwriting, a smudge of ink here, a faintly corrected figure there. To the unobservant these were trifles. To Purbright they formed a tapestry of human behavior. The discrepancies suggested that multiple hands had contributed to the record, perhaps under duress or caution, each anxious to preserve both accuracy and reputation. Love cleared his throat. "Do you think someone was covering something, sir?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, eyes scanning the ledger. "Or perhaps they merely sought reassurance in conformity. In Flaxwell, concern for appearances often rivals concern for fact. Both can leave equally revealing traces." Miss Grantham offered a small, tentative note. "I noticed a slight fold in one corner of a page. It does not appear accidental. I did not wish to disturb it." Purbright studied the fold, faint though it was, and traced its edge with a gloved fingertip. "An intentional crease," he said softly, suggesting attention or a deliberate marker. One might infer that the handler wished to note a particular entry without altering the ledger in a manner immediately obvious. He replaced the page carefully and observed Miss Grantham's subtle reaction. A quick intake of breath, a micro-adjustment of seating, a shift intended to convey composure. The inspector noted too the faint impression of a thumbprint near the margins, barely perceptible. "These minor marks," he continued, "may seem trivial, yet they speak to intent and hesitation. The most cautious hands often leave the clearest traces when concerned with propriety or self-preservation." Miss Grantham's gaze flickered toward the vestry door, then to the window, as if measuring the likelihood of observation from outside. Purbright's attention followed hers only in passing. He allowed her small gestures to unfold naturally, a map of anxiety rendered in posture and glance. "One wonders," he said, "whether such attention is self-motivated or prompted by the expectation of others. In either case, the traces remain." Love pointed to the edge of the ledger, where a faint line of graphite marked the margin. "Could that be a note, sir? Or just incidental?" Purbright regarded it with a polite, restrained interest. "Marginalia often conveys as much as entries themselves. In this instance, the line is neither purely decorative nor accidental. It may indicate contemplation, a reference, or a subtle warning. We cannot yet know which. A sudden, faint knock at the vestry door caused Miss Grantham to start slightly. Purbright allowed the interruption to pass without comment, noting only that the reaction, however minor, added a new layer to the web of observation. The ledger, meanwhile, remained central, a silent witness to multiple hands, each acting with intent, hesitation, or cautious diligence. As Purbright closed the ledger and replaced it upon the table, he observed a barely perceptible indent on the cover, a shallow mark that suggested pressure from something small and pointed. The evidence was inconclusive, yet it was enough to seed doubt and hint at deliberate handling beyond the ordinary. Even the most disciplined citizen, he reflected, might leave such a mark in a moment of quiet contemplation or subtle mischief. Stepping back, he allowed his gaze to linger on the ledger, the folds and the faint graphite line. It was a quiet tableau of attention, anxiety, and reputational care. Each mark and crease hinted at human behavior, carefully balanced between propriety and concealment. And, as ever, it left him with the silent question: which hand had pressed here, and for what precise purpose? Inspector Purbright spent the morning conducting interviews with members of the Chapel Guild in their homes, a slow and deliberate process designed to observe not only what was said, but the subtleties of posture, hesitation, and politeness. Snow still lingered in sheltered corners, a reminder of the previous week's chill. Yet the village moved with habitual care, gloved hands adjusted, coats arranged, and eyes averted just long enough to suggest modesty rather than guilt. Purbright followed the rhythm of domestic life, mindful that even the smallest gestures could reveal layers of intention. His first visit was to Mrs. Pendleton, a matron whose reputation for meticulous order extended to both household and committee. She greeted him with a nod, eyes briefly scanning the hallway, as if measuring for hidden observers. "Inspector," she said, "I trust you are well. I must confess the events of last week have prompted considerable reflection among us all." Purbright inclined his head. "Reflection is, I find, a necessary companion to any disruption of order. One wonders, however, whether reflection produces clarity or merely an appearance thereof." Mrs. Pendleton's lips twitched faintly, the barest acknowledgement of a smile, though her fingers remained tightly intertwined. "Clarity, sir, is elusive. We strive to maintain our routines, and yet subtle disturbances, misplaced letters, minor absences, have unsettled the usual rhythm." She gestured vaguely toward a table where a neat pile of correspondence awaited attention. "Subtle disturbances are often the most revealing," Purbright said gently, allowing the pause to stretch. "A mislaid note may indicate distraction, oversight, or deliberate misdirection. One must observe carefully, for the implications are seldom as obvious as the surface suggests." Mrs. Pendleton inclined her head, acknowledging the point. "I see, sir. I can assure you that our guild members have exercised care, though naturally human habit sometimes diverges from ideal conduct." The inspector departed with measured courtesy, noting the faint impression of a boot on the doorstep, slightly off-centre, suggestive of a purposeful pause before entry. Each mark in snow, each careful gesture indoors, contributed to the quiet accumulation of evidence. At Mr. and Mrs. Wainwright's home, Purbright encountered another layer of social complexity. The couple received him with restrained warmth, yet each movement carried subtle negotiation. Hands folded, glances exchanged, chairs adjusted. Mr. Wainwright began, "Inspector, we were most concerned to hear of Mr. Hollingby's condition. It is extraordinary how one's schedule may be so disrupted by a minor accident." Purbright inclined his head, regarding both with measured attention. Indeed, disruption often exposes subtle behaviours previously unnoticed. In small communities, deviations, however minor, reveal the character of those involved more reliably than overt declaration. Mrs. Wainwright added softly, "We have attempted to maintain our routines, though I admit the ledger and the letters have prompted considerable private discussion." Her words were careful, measured, yet Purbright noted the slight crease at the corner of her sleeve, a signal of restrained anxiety. "Private discussion," he said, with the gentlest emphasis, "often leaves traces beyond conversation. Gestures, postures, even the minutest alteration of routine can indicate internal recalibration. One observes more than one is told." As he departed, Purbright's gaze fell upon the garden path, where footprints intersected at unusual angles. They suggested a visitor or resident momentarily distracted, intervening in the ordinary flow of movement. No conclusion could yet be drawn, but the evidence hinted at subtle navigation through both physical and social space. The final interview of the morning was with Miss Hawthorne, a young woman of considerable attention to propriety, whose household radiated both precision and delicacy. She greeted Purbright with a careful nod, her hands folded upon the edge of a writing desk. "Inspector, I trust you are making progress. I am, of course, at your disposal should you require further information." "Thank you," Purbright said. "Your willingness is noted. I am chiefly interested in minor discrepancies, gestures of care or hesitation, and the ways in which attention to duty may reveal more than explicit statements." Miss Hawthorne's lips pressed lightly together. "I see. There have been subtle observations. Letters slightly misplaced, papers adjusted, members' movements unusually deliberate. Nothing overt, merely a series of minor corrections and attentions." Purbright's eyes lingered on her hands, noting the careful positioning of fingers, the brief lift of a wrist to smooth a pen mark, and the faint crease at the corner of a ledger sheet. Each motion carried weight, reflecting concern for both propriety and reputation. As he departed, the inspector paused at the threshold. A faint smudge upon the doorstep, barely discernible against the stone, suggested that someone had paused deliberately before entry, leaving evidence of hesitation or intentional marking. Purbright filed the observation silently, noting that even the most controlled households left subtle signatures of behavior, and that the confluence of gesture, posture, and minor discrepancy often proved more telling than any explicit confession. Stepping into the crisp air, Purbright observed the village with renewed attention. The intersecting footprints, the creased ledger corners, and the small, deliberate smudges collectively suggested a choreography of quiet anxiety and careful concealment. Even the most unremarkable gestures seemed loaded with significance, and he found himself considering not only what had occurred, but what was intended to appear as having occurred. In Flaxwell, he reflected, contradictions were rarely overt. They were polite, silent, and deliberate, a gentle dissonance designed to protect reputation while hinting at private unease. And as he traced the faint imprint of a boot against the chapel's steps through the snow, he permitted himself a small question. Which of these carefully modulated actions concealed observation, and which concealed intent? Inspector Purbright returned to the village in mid-afternoon, the winter sun low and pale, casting long shadows across the snow-sprinkled lanes. He intended to reconcile the accounts of several guild members whose recollections of the morning's events had begun to diverge in subtle yet telling ways. Constable Love followed, clipboard in hand, prepared to record testimony with the meticulousness of a clerk, though his eyebrows betrayed a hint of bewilderment at the complexity of politeness intersecting with suspicion. Purbright's first appointment was with Mr. Pennitis, the verger, whose habitual morning rounds had made him both observer and participant in the chapel's social choreography. Penitentiary greeted him with his usual solemnity, hat held just so, gloves adjusted, and coat buttoned to a precise height. "Inspector," he said, "I trust your morning has proceeded without undue disturbance." "Indeed," Purbright replied, "though I find that minor deviations in routine often reveal more than adherence to schedule. Your rounds yesterday, any unusual observations?" The verger's mouth twitched slightly, as if considering whether an admission would breach decorum. "Only the usual congregation of parishioners, sir. Some lingered longer than customary, perhaps pausing over the steps." His eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the lower chapel stones, a subtle acknowledgement of the previous incident. "Pausing? Yes," Purbright said, letting the word linger. "Pauses, especially in the presence of others, often suggest reflection, or perhaps hesitation. The precise intent, however, may remain uncertain." Next, he visited Mrs. Blythe, whose domestic attentions reflected a carefully calibrated concern for both propriety and observation. She received him in the drawing room, hands folded lightly atop the polished surface of her side table. "Inspector," she said, "I hope you will forgive the disruption of your schedule. I can assure you, everything within our home remains in proper order." Purbright inclined his head. "Disruption is rarely of the home alone, Mrs. Blythe. One finds that social perturbations often leave minor traces, displacements, folds, subtle smudges that escape ordinary notice yet provide insight for attentive observation." Her fingers shifted, barely, as though repositioning to conceal unconscious movement. "Indeed, sir," she murmured. "Though I cannot speak to the precise timing of others' arrivals, I did note several members attending with more deliberation than usual." Her eyes flickered to the ledger, resting in a corner, a silent nod to its continued significance. The inspector's visits continued in a similar pattern, each interview layered. Observation upon polite statement, each response a careful negotiation between honesty and discretion. Mr. Wainwright claimed a brief stroll to collect morning correspondence, though a slight hesitation in phrasing, "I might have paused longer than intended," suggested a self-conscious alteration of recollection. Mrs. Wainwright emphasized diligence in household routine, yet a faint crease on her sleeve betrayed the anxiety of conscientious maintenance. At the vicarage, Reverend Tolliver greeted Purbright with his habitual calm, though the slight tightness at the corners of his mouth suggested subtle preoccupation. He described the morning as entirely unremarkable, yet when Purbright noted minor inconsistencies in the ledger entries, Tolliver's fingers brushed a pencil mark unconsciously, a gesture that, while polite, hinted at internal recalibration. By late afternoon, Purbright returned to the vestry, bringing together observations from multiple households. The overlapping alibis created a lattice of subtle contradictions, slight delays here, minor hesitations there, gestures of reassurance that masked faint anxiety. Each citizen had maintained the decorum expected in Flaxwell, yet the accumulation of careful divergences suggested the presence of minor, deliberate omissions. Constable Love, leafing through his notes, whispered, "Sir, it seems everyone's account fits the others almost too well." "Precisely," Purbright murmured. "Politeness and caution often produce the illusion of concordance, yet beneath the surface one observes the traces of hesitation, minor adjustments, and silent reflection. Each is a signature of intention, however concealed." Miss Grantham arrived quietly, holding a small bundle of letters. "Inspector," she said, "some correspondence remains undelivered, held for observation. I thought it prudent that you review them, as they may provide context for the alibis." Purbright accepted the letters, noting faint indentations on several envelopes, small pressures indicative of deliberate handling. He examined the stack, noting variations in alignment and subtle signs of repeated attention. Deliberate, though careful, he said softly. Someone intended to influence perception or to preserve options for subsequent interpretation. The intention, like the footprints in snow, is only faintly visible, yet present. As he departed the vestry, Purbright lingered by the chapel steps, observing the faint impressions left by boots and gloves. One mark, partially obscured by melting snow, appeared slightly out of alignment with the others. He crouched to examine it, noting the subtle irregularity, a gentle angle, a shift in weight, a hesitation before movement resumed. It was, perhaps, trivial, a minor deviation among many, but in Flaxwell, triviality was rarely accidental. He straightened, noting the footprints that converged and diverged, overlaying one another with careful precision. Each citizen's account had been polite, measured, and technically consistent, yet the physical traces suggested overlapping movement, quiet observation, and a layer of deliberate caution not yet acknowledged. Purbright's gaze rested on the faint impression, allowing the subtle irregularity to register. The alibis aligned, yet one step, one hesitation, might reveal the quiet divergence between intent and appearance. And as he walked away, he permitted himself the silent question, which among these carefully curated accounts concealed more than mere memory? Inspector Purbright spent the morning observing the quiet domestic rhythms of Flaxwell, seeking not disturbances but the subtle signs of unease that lingered beneath routine. Snow had melted in patches, leaving dark, damp paths along which villagers moved with habitual politeness, glancing neither too far nor too closely at one another. Purbright's attention focused on the gestures that accompanied conversation, the precise placement of gloves upon tables, the gentle repositioning of chairs, the faint hesitation before answering a question. Such minutiae, he knew, often revealed more than the spoken word. His first call was to Mr. Hollingby's cousin, Mr. Eversley, a man whose presence in Flaxwell had always been unobtrusive, yet whose subtle influence permeated guild activities. Eversley greeted him with customary restraint, his hands folded neatly, lips pressed, and eyes lowered for only the briefest fraction of a second. "Inspector," he said softly, "I am at your disposal, though I fear there is little of import I can provide." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, "though even minor observations may illuminate intention. In a community such as Flaxwell, subtle anxieties often manifest in gestures rather than declarations." He gestured toward a small writing table where Eversley had arranged letters in neat stacks. Each was aligned to the millimeter, yet a slight shadow across the edges suggested repeated handling. Eversley cleared his throat. "There has been discussion, of course, sir. Private, discreet conversation. Of certain behaviors, scheduling, and correspondence. I can assure you no impropriety, yet expectations have prompted reflection." His voice dropped slightly, a deliberate modulation designed to indicate both candor and caution. Purbright inclined his head, noting the tension at the edges of Eversley's eyes. Reflection often invites both self-examination and speculation upon others. One cannot separate anxiety for reputation from concern for observation. Both leave traces. Next, Purbright visited Mrs. Blythe once more, whose domestic order now bore subtle signs of strain. A slightly misaligned cushion, a delicate fold in tablecloth, a book resting just a fraction askew. She greeted him with her usual courtesy, though her fingers lingered nervously on a silver tray as she gestured him to a seat. "Inspector, I feared I might have overlooked some detail in our prior discussion. I have since reviewed the morning's events with care." "Review often reveals inconsistencies invisible at first," Purbright said. "Even the most conscientious may alter recollection to accommodate propriety." I am not here to adjudicate, only to observe the signs left behind." She nodded, faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Indeed, sir. One must attend both to action and appearance. Some behaviours, while proper, may nonetheless prompt scrutiny if circumstances shift." Her gaze lingered briefly on the window-sill, where traces of snow suggested minor foot traffic, carefully avoided yet present. As he departed, Purbright noticed a small mark upon the doorstep, a slight indentation that suggested a pause, the heel pressing for longer than necessary. In isolation, it was trivial. In the larger pattern of observation, it hinted at deliberation. The inspector then proceeded to the Wainwright household, where Mr. Wainwright recounted a morning interrupted by a series of minor tasks: collecting letters, assisting with household arrangements, attending to the fire. Yet his account was punctuated by careful timing, small hesitations, and polite adjustments. Mrs. Wainwright, standing nearby, occasionally corrected details in hushed tones, a dance of cooperative narrative designed to preserve appearances while providing subtle corroboration. Purbright observed silently the minute shifts of body and eye, noting each divergence between statement and gesture. In Flaxwell, he reflected, the most careful accounts were rarely exact. Reputational anxiety often introduced a soft dissonance between fact and perception. Miss Grantham arrived with a small package of correspondence, each envelope bearing faint impressions, as if someone had reviewed them repeatedly before delivery. "Inspector," she said, "these letters arrived just this morning. Some appear to have been handled more than once, though I cannot account for whom beyond myself." Purbright examined the impressions, noting the faint, deliberate folds and slight irregularities in alignment. "Repeated handling," he murmured, "may suggest rehearsal, careful attention, or an intention to influence perception. The marks themselves are silent yet informative." Finally, as he returned to the chapel steps, Purbright observed a pattern in the snow, footprints intersecting at unusual angles, faint smudges upon the stones, and a heel pressed at an unnatural pause. One trace, slight yet distinct, seemed almost deliberately placed, a hesitation that suggested observation or quiet contemplation. He considered the overlapping alibis, the careful gestures, and the minor discrepancies in correspondence and recollection. Each villager had performed with decorum, yet the cumulative signs revealed tension, attention, and subtle anxiety. The indicators were minor, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they suggested that intent, or at least concern for, observation, permeated the morning. As he walked away from the steps, Purbright allowed himself a final reflection. In Flaxwell one never sees intent directly. One sees only the shadow it casts upon gesture, correspondence, and social routine. And in that shadow one may glimpse the silent stirrings of motive, awaiting the right moment to emerge fully. Inspector Purbright returned to the chapel in the soft light of late afternoon, the air crisp and still, carrying the faint aroma of damp stone and residual snow. The village of Flaxwell had settled into its habitual rhythms, yet beneath the polite facades a network of subtle tensions persisted. Each household, each member of the guild, had left behind a constellation of gestures, minor marks, and hushed observations, traces that, though invisible to most, coalesced into a quiet pattern of human intent. Today Purbright intended to observe the nexus of these traces, allowing them to suggest meaning without forcing conclusions. He began with the ledger, now central on the vestry table, its pages arranged with deliberate care. Miss Grantham had placed it there earlier, along with the correspondence she had collected throughout the week. Each envelope bore faint impressions, corners slightly creased, and lines of graphite along margins that hinted at repeated handling. Purbright examined these minutiae, noting the variations in pressure and the slight irregularities in alignment, as though each letter had been considered, measured, and, in a sense, rehearsed. Constable Love, standing at a respectful distance, murmured, "Sir, it seems as though everyone was careful, perhaps too careful." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "Yet the very meticulousness of care often betrays what is not said. The most polite citizen, in attempting to preserve appearance, may leave the subtlest trace of anxiety, hesitation, or intention." He lifted a folded corner of a letter, observing the faint thumbprint beneath the crease. Even the most conscientious cannot fully escape their gestures. He then reviewed the recent interviews, mentally overlaying the accounts from the Wainwrights, Mrs. Blythe, Reverend Tolliver, and Mr. Eversley. Each had presented a performance of decorum. Each had offered alibis seemingly free of contradiction. Yet the traces, folded papers, adjusted sleeves, slight hesitations in speech, formed a lattice of behaviors that intersected imperfectly, revealing a pattern invisible to casual observation. At this point, Miss Hawthorne entered, carrying a small tray of writing implements. She placed it on a side table with exactitude, aligning pens and ink carefully along the edge. "Inspector," she said softly, "I thought it might be useful to have these available, in case notes are required." "I hope the arrangements are satisfactory." Purbright allowed a gentle pause, observing her posture, the careful positioning of her hands, the slight contraction at the corner of her mouth. "Very satisfactory," he said. "Indeed, the very arrangement speaks to both diligence and caution. One may discern attention to routine, yet also apprehension of observation." As he turned his attention back to the ledger and letters, he noted something previously overlooked. A slight indentation across several envelopes, forming a line that suggested repeated handling by the same hand. It was subtle, barely perceptible, yet distinct enough to hint at deliberate review, perhaps signaling a particular entry of interest or concern. "Constable," Purbright said, "observe these impressions. The repetition implies intention, but not necessarily malice. It is the very careful rehearsal of attention that can conceal more than it reveals." Love nodded quietly, understanding that the significance lay not in overt wrongdoing, but in the interplay of social expectation and personal anxiety. In Flaxwell, as Purbright often reflected, the greatest clues were not loud or dramatic. They resided in gestures, pauses, and minor divergences from routine. He rose and walked to the chapel steps, where the snow had begun to soften, revealing a faint pattern of footprints from earlier in the week. One mark, slightly angled, differed from the others. He crouched, examining the subtle depression where weight had lingered longer than necessary. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated with the cumulative observations he had gathered: hesitation, deliberation, and attention to appearance. As he straightened, Purbright considered the pattern in its entirety: overlapping alibis, careful handling of correspondence, repeated gestures of propriety, and the faint footprints that traced pauses upon the steps. Each alone was trivial. Together they suggested a web of subtle intention, a quiet orchestration of behavior designed to maintain appearances while allowing private observation. He paused, allowing his eyes to sweep the vestry once more. The ledger, the letters, the careful alignment of furnishings, the residual marks in the snow, all formed a tableau of social negotiation. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden confession. Instead, there was clarity in convergence, the quiet intersection of actions, gestures, and hesitations that revealed both care and concern, subtle observation, and the faint shadow of motive. As he turned to leave, Purbright permitted himself a final, silent reflection. In Flaxwell, truth was rarely shouted. It merged in whispers, in pauses, in deliberate attention to appearance. And here, on the chapel steps and among the carefully arranged ledgers, one could perceive the faintest outlines of intention, an elegant, understated pattern that, if read correctly, might explain both accident and anxiety. The inspector stepped into the corridor, leaving the ledger open, the letters aligned, and the traces intact. Outside, the snow continued to soften, footprints merging, fading. Yet the question remained, delicate and precise. Which of these carefully maintained gestures concealed mere caution, and which concealed something more deliberate?